here at this first sign, it will basically explain what happened here at the Battle of Birch Coulee and what is Birch Coulee. So each of these signs here kind of look like this. And what happened at Birch Coulee is just before sunrise on September 2nd, 1862, the sharp crack of a warning shot signaled that the start of Battle of Birch Coulee. One of the bloodiest battles of the U.S.-Dakota War was fought here. For a day and a half, this place echoed with the sounds of gunfire, the moans of wounded men, and the cries of terrified horses. More than 20 men and 90 horses were killed here. And as we follow through the trail, we'll discover the different causes and the consequences of the battle. Why it's called Birch Coulee, how Birch Coulee got its name, is coulee is a French word for a deep stream bed with steep sides. It might be dry, it might be filled with water. Birch Coulee is in this wooded area off to your right. I'll show you a picture. And where paper birch trees were once very plentiful. And the Dakota people called this place the place of the white birch. And if you would look to your right there, that whole tree line is where the coulee is located. This next sign here is probably one of my favorite signs just because it explains about the two men and the two different perspectives and views that you're going to get about the same war. And so when we talk about how important it is to have first-person accounts, this is about as close as we are going to get. So the story of Birch Coulee is told through the two different men here. And as we go through the sign and the trails, we'll have information from both of them. So one of them, whose picture is first here, is Joseph Anderson. So he is a captain of the U.S. Army. And then Wabatonka, also known as Big Eagle, is a Medawakatan chief. And so Anderson is one of the two commanders at Birch Coulee. He led a mounted force called the Cullen Frontier Guards. And then Big Eagle is one of the 4 Dakota leaders that was at the battle. The memories of the battle were actually published in the St. Paul Pioneer Press in 1894. Anderson wrote a letter to a fellow veteran that was reprinted in the newspaper. And then Big Eagle was interviewed through an interpreter. So this is a picture of Big Eagle. And the section here is called Combined Forces. So the Dakota Indians living in Minnesota in 1862 belonged to 4 different bands. So I have trouble pronouncing all of these, so I'll do my best, But the Medawakatan, the Wapekute, Sisseton, and Wapiton. And the Dakota leaders who fought at Birch Coulee only represented or were from 2 of those bands. So Big Eagle and Mankato, so Blue Earth, and then Gray Bird were from the Medawakatan band leaders, while the last one, Red Legs, was from Wapekute chief. The Dakota people who were killed in the battle, so they said there's 2 of them that died, was a Wapekute and a Sisseton, and they all belonged to the Hush Asha's band. This next sign is titled Wrong Place, Wrong Time. So, scenes from the war zone. Many of the sketches reproduced along this trail were made by Albert Colgrave. He was a 22-year-old artist who joined Company G, the 6th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment, in September 1862. So around the time that the U.S.-Dakota War broke out, he was becoming well known in St. Paul for his theatrical backdrops. And so all of the sketches that you will see on these signs are his first-person sketches of the scenes of the war. And so he sketched dozens of scenes. He did die of typhoid fever in Glencoe, Minnesota in March 1863. When the men in advance reached Little Crow's village, they saw a column of mounted men and some wagons going eastward. So the men in advance were Dakota Scouts. According to Wamdatanka, they were traveling in a group of several hundred towards New Ulm, where an attack was planned. They had stopped at the village of Little Crow to gather belongings left behind during the siege. So the mounted men were Anderson and his command. They were part of a burial detail, 150 volunteer soldiers and civilians that were sent from Fort Ridgely to bury victims of the war that had been raging across the region. So these Dakota men, these Dakota Scouts, were actually on their way to New Ulm when they happened to come across the soldiers that were at Birch Coulee that decided to camp there at the time. All right, it is super, super windy out here, but I'm gonna try this video anyway. So where I'm at is in the circular area, and there are these different markers where if you put your feet and then look in that direction, you would be able to see where each chief and his soldiers, where they were located. And there are these white posts. If you look, I think you'll be able to see this white post right over there is where that one was. And this last chief here and his men, and the coulee is right, whoa, it is super windy, everybody. The coulee, so the Birch Coulee, is behind me, and I think you'll be able to see the white post back there. If not, I do have a picture of it. This circle area where the path circles around and where that white post is, this is where the U.S. soldiers primarily set up their camp. And this sign is titled "A Beautiful Place to Encamp." It was indeed a very beautiful place, but it proved to be an unfortunate one for us, as the enemy had the advantage of both the timber and hill for protection, as said by Joseph Anderson. To cover the largest possible area, the burial detail split into two groups on September 1st. Anderson and his men went south of the Minnesota River, while a group headed by Captain Hiram Grant scoured the land north of the river. The two groups rejoined at the campsite Grant chose. Despite Anderson's misgivings about the site, he and his men settled in for the night. And here's a picture of the sketch of Birch Coulee. Notice there's not nearly as many trees as there is now, and you can see the creek, the stream that goes through the middle. An error in judgment. Everything indicated that the Indians had all removed up to Yellow Medicine near Upper Sioux Agency, Anderson said, about Grant's fateful choice of a campsite. Although many felt uneasy, the men camped where they had been assured no Dakota forces would attack. Grant chose a site on ground level, close to trees and water, less than a half-mile from the road to Fort Ridgely, and a low-lying area open to gunfire. So the place that they had chose to camp was not near or close enough. They were kind of out in the open. And especially in the valley, the Dakota scouts could see where Anderson and his men had camped from all the way across the valley. So how they noticed them is the Dakota people were on like the redwood side of the valley up on top, and they could see and hear all the way across people camping there. And so they were able to basically kind of ambush them. They had the protection of the coulee. They had an endless supply of water due to the stream. And so there was an error in where they chose to camp. Battle tactics. So from Big Eagle, he says, it was concluded to surround the camp that night and attack it at daylight. We felt sure we could capture it. After the Dakota scouts spotted Anderson's men crossing the prairie, they were sent to follow the movements of the soldiers creeping across the prairie like so many ants, Mom Tatanka said. When the scouts reported that the U.S. soldiers were camped near Birch Coulee, the Dakota forces planned their attack. About 200 men, led by the 4 main leaders, moved in to surround the camp. And here's a picture and view of the camp that they would have been surrounding. The best we could. Big Eagle did not support the Dakota decision to fight a war because he thought it was a lost cause. He said, I did not have a very large band, not more than 30 or 40 fighting men, he said. Most of them were not for the war at first. I said to my men that I would lead them into war, and we would all act like brave Dakotas and do the best we could. And so from this sign to continue along the path, you can see where that white like semi-truck in the distance, that is Highway 71. So you can kind of just get a visual to how close that the battlefield is off of 71. The prairie factor. I led my men up from the west through the grass and took up position 200 yards from the camp behind a small knoll. So where this sign is we're standing where Big Eagle and his band took cover during the battle. So there's this knoll or this small hill that is in front of this sign that kept them out of sight and out of view. And the landscape played a very significant role in the battle. The grass was very, very tall, and so you couldn't really see through it very much. And the wetlands to the south and the north of the campsite were effective hiding places for the Dakota men as well. Here's another image of the battle. Someone making camp. Tall grass in a dark night. Remember, they decided to kind of ambush them at night, be in position, and then when day started, then they would attack. So the stars and the full moon were the only light sources aiding the U.S. pickets at Birch Coulee. They were expected to stay alert, listening closely, and watching for the slightest movements. The cover of darkness was a crucial element in the Dakota battle strategy. Dakota forces surrounded the campsite and made their attack before dawn. And so on the sign talked about kind of this knoll, this little hill here. So you can see where that pole sticks up. That was the post of where the settlers were camped, and that's also where that circle area was, where if you put your feet down, you could see where the various people had, or where the various Dakota leaders were kind of stationed and surrounding them. Here's another picture of that knoll, of that hill. Dakota positions. Big Eagle says, "We had no difficulty in surrounding the camp. The pickets were only a little way from it. No soldier would have attempted to climb this hill during the battle, but by standing here, you can get a sense of the Dakota position. So you can see when Big Eagle talked about being behind that knoll, it kind of gives us a visual of what they would have been seeing. So while they're behind this hill, meanwhile, Redlegs took his men, into the Coulee to the east of the camp. Mankato had some of his men in the Coulee and some on the prairie. Graybird and his men were mostly in the prairie." And so here's a map that kind of gives all of their positions, where they would be at. So when we talk about those white posts at different parts of the camp, this is kind of an aerial view of them. An easy time of it. The Dakota men could eat and rest during the battle, unlike the U.S. counterparts. "We had an easy time of it," said Big Eagle. "We would crawl through the grass and into the coulee and get water when we wanted it, and after a few hours our women crossed the river and came up near the bluff and cooked for us, and we could go back and eat and then return to fight." And so this coulee really provided them shelter. It was a place to rest. It was safe. They could eat and then go back to fighting. And when you're at the battlefield, it has these footprints again that lead to, when you look that direction, where the U.S. campsite is. And here's a visual from this angle specifically. And again, that row of trees is where the coulee is located. The fight was on. So one of the sentinels fired, and the shot was followed by a heavy volley from the Indians, which killed and wounded several of our men, and the fight was on, says Joseph Anderson. So once the Dakota people during the night had surrounded the camp, on the early morning of September 2nd, a U.S. guard sensed movement in the grass and fired a warning shot. And so with that warning shot, then the Dakota men immediately returned fire. "I scrambled out of my tent on my hands and knees," Anderson recalled. "At the top of my voice, shouted to the men to keep low, grab their arms, get to the front line of the camp, and to hold back the Indians." Two views of the battle. Anderson reported that men under his command shielded themselves behind overturned wagons and dead horses during the battle. Grant's men, Anderson recalled, jumped to their feet when the battle started. Big Eagle saw them. "The white men stood up and exposed themselves first, but at last they learned to keep quiet." Some of the U.S. soldiers had seen action before, but many of them were new recruits. And so the Civil War is going on at this point, and so majority of the soldiers who have experience are fighting on the front lines of the Civil War. And so these soldiers are either very, very new or kind of the leftovers, essentially. And so with this force, it was a lot of civilian volunteers, and they didn't have battle experience at all. Battle scars. While this fight was much easier for the Dakota people, just with their strategy, their experience, their where they have people located, etc. It was quite the struggle for the white settlers. And rendered useless, this is a picture here of firearms that they have found. And so after the soldiers had used their first round of ammunition, they went to the supply officer, and the supply officer had sent bullets that were too large for the guns that they had. Again, when the Civil War is going on, all of the ammunition went to there, and so when they were sent out, they were just kind of given, here's this ammunition. And the men had lost time trying to shave down these bullets and ammunition so that they would fit into their guns. It was only really a matter of time before the white soldiers, settlers, would lose this battle. Their food, their provisions were gone within about that first day. And since they were surrounded, they had no access to fresh water because the Dakota people controlled the stream that was going through the Coulee. On the second day of the fight, we were reinforced, Anderson said, which ended one of the hardest and best fought battles known. Early in the afternoon of September 3rd, U.S. forces heard 2 cannon blasts coming from the east. Could help be near. When reinforcements failed to appear, they gave up hope. Several hours later, troops from Fort Ridgely finally arrived. The Dakota forces spotted the troops, ceased fire, and vanished. After 36 hours, the Battle of Birch Coulee was over. We could have taken the camp. According to Big Eagle, the Dakota men had a plan to charge the campsite. During the fight, the whites had thrown up breastworks, but they were not very high, and we could have easily jumped over them. We could have taken the camp, I think. The Dakota leaders changed their plans when they spotted U.S. reinforcements. Mankato and about 50 Dakota men rushed towards the reinforcements, stopping them in their tracks for several hours. When additional U.S. troops moved in, however, the Dakota headed south across the Minnesota River to their old villages, then upriver to Yellow Medicine. After the battle. Soon after the battle, I, with many others who had taken part in the war, surrendered to General Sibley. As soon as I surrendered, I was thrown in prison, Big Eagle said. After 3 years in jail, he rejoined his band in Nebraska. He moved back to Minnesota in 1869 and died in Granite Falls in 1906. Joseph Anderson was wounded at Birch Coulee and went home to St. Paul after the battle. He left Minnesota in 1877, returning once in 1894 for the dedication of the Birch Coulee monuments in Morton. He died 3 years later in Oklahoma City. They say Minnesota nice. So with this painting here, there is the soldiers in the front, and then in the back right corner you can see the gallows. Francis J. Yellow is a member of the Lakota Cheyenne River Reservation, South Dakota. A visual artist and poet, he expresses his belief in the sacredness of humanity through his work. So in that painting that I showed you, mentioned to you prior, Yellow depicts the clash of cultures that culminated in the U.S.-Dakota War. The scaffold at the upper right refers to the government's trial and execution of the 40 Dakota men after the war. So 38 were initially hung right away in Mankato, and then there were 2 other men that were executed at Fort Snelling. In the previous video set of pictures, I mentioned how Joseph Anderson, so he is one of the people telling the story of this battle at Birch Coulee, he returned once to Minnesota for the dedication of these markers that were placed around the battlefield. And so where the first one is located, so there's the entrance sign on the left side there, is right along the edge of the battlefield. And here are 3 of the 4 signs. When I was going through the battlefield, I missed one somewhere. And so this marker commemorates the Battle of Birch Coulee. In 1898, the Minnesota Valley Historical Society was founded to mark significant places related to the U.S.-Dakota War. This marker is one of 4 placed near the battlefield by the Minnesota Valley Historical Society. So here is the first one. It says west of the Crest Hill and 755 east was one of the principal points of attack by the Sioux Indians under Big Eagle, September 23rd, 1862. It's a little bit closer view of that granite stone. Not all of the stones and markers are in nearly as good a shape. This is another one that was kind of at the other side of the battlefield. This is one that's on the very edge, and the start of this tree line is the tree line where the coulee is located. I believe it says 600 feet south in the ravine, the white were attacked by Sioux Indians under Mankato. So in September 1862. I am now down in Birch Coulee Park, so just kind of stopped along this little bridge here. You can see the creek along there. I drove down into the Birch Coulee Park here. Just gonna kind of give you a little view. There's a nice shelter there, has a pretty cool fireplace in the back. The creek runs along that side. And we'll go over and see what adventure this little bridge brings us. To be quite honest, no idea where I'm at. And I've already hiked a lot of hills today, but hey, we will see what is up here. Trail just kind of ends or goes to the other side of the park. So as I was at the park, just kind of looking around, enjoying the sunshine, I see this big, huge, round thing. And I was like, what in the world is that? It is an enormous part of a tree. This tree cookie is absolutely huge.